June 25th, 1998. Survivor's first name Marianne. Survivor's last name now Green. Survivor's last name at birth Jakob Fee. Interviewer Susan Goitein. City London. Country England. Language spoken English. It's June 25th, 1998. My name is Susan Goitein, Goitein. I am conducting an interview with Mrs. Marianne Green. We are in London, England. The language spoken is English, and this is tape number 1. Can you state your name, please?
Marianne Green, M-A-R-I-A-N-N-E, G-R-E-E-N.
And your date of birth?
February the 10th, 1928.
And where were you born?
In Romania.
And your age now?
70.
What was your maiden name?
Jakob Fee.
Can you spell that?
J-A-K-A-B-F-I.
Mrs. Green, can you take me back before the war to your childhood and describe to me your family?
Although I refer to my hometown as Oradea, I spent the first 12 years of my childhood in a little village about 25 miles away from Oradea called Alezd. It was really a very small agricultural village. And that's where my earliest recollections come from. I remember being in my cot and being told to be quiet at night because my sister Vitsuko is asleep. Now, I couldn't have been more than 2. I may have been less than that. I was told it's impossible to remember something that young. But I think I do remember it because there was nothing sensational or special in this memory to warrant talking about it in the family. So I think this is my own genuine memory. I grew up in this house, which was quite a large house, quite uncomfortable really, because there were lots of steps up and it needed a lot of staff and a lot of work to keep it warm and clean and everything. We didn't have electricity during the daytime, only at night for lighting. So everything that today is done by electricity had to be done by hand. Polishing the floor and cleaning the carpets and ironing with embers, cooking with wood fire, everything was done by hand, manually. I had a happy childhood, a very sheltered childhood. Nothing very much happened, and I suppose this is the hallmark of a happy childhood.
What was your position in your family?
I was the youngest of 2 children. I have an elder an elder sister.
And what is the age difference between you?
Nearly 7 years, 6.5.
And your sister's name?
Eva. E-V-A.
What is your strongest memory of your mother when you were a child?
Oh, I have many memories of my mother, many memories. She was beautiful, very, very attractive, and good company. She could laugh a lot, and she was really the life and soul of a party when there were parties, which we had from time to time. Everybody loved her. And obviously I loved her very much, but I was being that much younger than my sister, I was left out of many things that she took part in. They were more like friends, and later on when I grew up, then I was included in this group of friends. But when I was little, I was just the little one.
Do you remember any special times at home?
How do you mean special times?
Holiday times or festival times?
Well, nothing terribly special. You know, the high holidays were kept. Nothing else was kept very much. We were quite secular, really. During the summer, we would go swimming in the river. There was a river not far away. And there was a family business in the village, father and two sons, who kept horses and carriages. So they would come to pick us up and take us there to the river and pick us up 2 hours later or 3 hours later as arranged, bring us home. We would take a picnic. And that was almost a daily occurrence because summers were very hot usually. And that was lovely. I always looked forward to that.
What was your mother's name?
Irene,
And her-
I-R-E-N, and with an accent on the E.
And her maiden name?
Chillog.
And your father?
My father was a lawyer, and his office, or offices I should say, were by the side of the house, next to the house. So he would come home for lunch, and in fact the maid would come down, go down to him about 11 o'clock and take him a cup of tea. He'd come home for lunch and then he would go back, and in summer he would come home quite early, about 3 o'clock. In winter he would work later.
And how would you describe your father?
My father was a very precise person, very demanding. He was demanding of himself as well, and of everybody else. And his desk was immaculate, always. If you opened his drawer and you saw a few pencils and pens there, and you took one out, he immediately noticed that one was missing. That sort of a person. He was good fun, loved travel. He didn't actually travel very much because he was working. He sent us on holidays mainly. And then perhaps he joined us for a week at the end, but he loved travel. And he had friends. We had card evenings, not bridge or poker, mainly rummy. And that was played with cubes. There is a modern game called Rummy Cube or Rummy Cub, I'm not sure. And that was the sort of, those were the bricks that we played with. But it was more like modern day kaluki. It was 14 cards or 14 bricks. And I played that with my grandmother very often. My grandmothers lived with us. Both grandmothers lived with us. My mother's mother was quite young, and she really ran the household. And I saw a lot of her. She would, when I was little, she would get me up in the morning and get me ready for school. And in the evenings, I would play cards with her. She wasn't very good at these cards. I don't think her mind was there for that. So I usually beat her.
You had a close relationship with her?
Yes, very close. I loved her very much. And my other grandmother, my paternal grandmother, lived with us also, but she was much older. She was about 20 years older than my mother's mother. And she lived in a separate little wing of the house. She was more or less bedridden. She would get up in the morning and sit in a chair, but she couldn't walk around. She didn't see very well. She had glaucoma. So I remember we had to put drops in her eyes. My sister did that often when she was home, and later on when I was bigger I did it. And she was a very cultured lady. She was a German teacher in her youth, and she taught me German. She insisted that I learn to read and write Gothic characters, which nobody did anymore. In the schools where they taught German, they used Latin characters, not Gothic. But to this day, I'm able to write Gothic. And that was the background. My parents, grandparents, my sister, when she was little, when she was at home, we would play together a little bit. She didn't have much patience for me. After all, when I was 3 and she was nearly 10, it's understandable. But we were friends. We were always friends, except she used to annoy me sometimes, on purpose. She loved to see how I get angry, get annoyed. And then, of course, she was sorry. When I really got annoyed, then she was sorry and she was cuddling me. But we were very close, always. And when she reached the age of 10, 11, Then she was sent off to boarding school in the nearby town of Oradea.
Coming back to your hometown at that present time, were there any other members of your family or members of staff who lived in your household with you?
In Alezd, in the little village, yes, yes. There was a maid, and there was a cook, usually.
Did you have any people looking after you, or was that done by your mother?
I had a nanny. I call her a nanny, but she was German. She was a Fräulein, as they called them then. And I remember two of them particularly. One was Fräulein Emma, who was a real career nanny. She got us up in the morning and we had to get dressed, no dilly-dallying, and we had to go out for a walk, come back and do a bit of reading or whatever. And our whole life was regimented, but it suited me, I quite liked it. And another one was Fräulein Frida, who loved to embroider. So she sat there, I remember winter evenings mainly, when she sat and embroidered. And they played with me. You know, I loved to make things. So she would make a little house out of cardboard, that sort of thing. I loved that. I mean, I would assist. she did the making and I did the assisting. Or sewing clothes for my dolls. I liked that too.
What other hobbies did you have?
I didn't really have any real hobbies. I was a great reader. I loved reading. And I was a fast reader. And I could read at a very early age. I think I was 3 or 4. And in those days that was rare, because you only went to school at 6. And you didn't learn to read before 6. But I did. And I sometimes went down to my father's office and I was allowed to use one of the typewriters to write a letter to my sister, who was by then in boarding school. I couldn't write, you know, cursive writing. I could print a little bit, but this is the way I communicated with her. I could type. And I read. There was a weekly magazine which was published in Budapest and to which we were subscribed, which had a little supplement for children. I loved that. I got it every week. It had puzzles, it had stories, things like that.
How many Jewish families approximately lived in Alezd?
Oh, quite a few, considering that it was a very small village. There was the doctor, the pharmacist, dentist. There were 1 or 2 other lawyers. Those I know of. The others were sort of, you know, peasant children I played with and so on. But these were Jewish families.
And was Alezd consisting mainly of traders? And if so, what was the main commercial field in Alezd?
I think it was mainly agricultural, not commercial so far. There was a tiny little shop, a stationery shop, and there was a post office. And a grocer. I don't remember there being a greengrocer, there must have been, but once a week there was a market and Bulgarians came over every week with their wares, you know, with their products, or produce I should say. And people would buy for a whole week, knowing that the following week they would come again.
Did you go to school in Alezd?
Yes. When I was 6 or 7, 6 I think, I was sent to the boarding school where my sister was learning as a boarder. And I must have been homesick because I didn't eat well, I lost weight, so my parents decided to take me out. And the following 3 classes, or 3 period classes, I spent in Alezd at the village school, which was mixed, of course, boys and girls. And I was quite a good pupil.
Were there other Jewish children in the school?
There were quite a few Jewish children, yes.
And what about your teachers?
Teachers weren't Jewish. No, none of them that I remember. I mean, we didn't have many teachers because one teacher took a whole class for nearly everything.
Did you have a favorite teacher?
Yes, yes, I liked Domna Jacob, Mrs. Jacob, but she wasn't Jewish. Her name was Jacob, but she wasn't Jewish. She was very pleasant, very nice. And the headmaster was also, he was a Romanian, and his name was Bumbulescu.
And you remained in the school in Alești until you were approximately how old?
Until I was 12.
And then?
In 1940, we moved to Oradea. That was because the Hungarians came in. There was this Pact of Vienna, as a result of which the Hungarian regime, the Hungarians came in, the Romanians had to leave, and anti-Semitism started, really. Until that point, I never knew what anti-Semitism was.
How did it manifest itself?
Well, to me, as a child, I didn't feel it very much, but I heard it all around me. And because of that, my mother decided that we would be better off in a larger community where, if necessary, we could hide. Because in that little village, everybody knew us. There was nowhere to go. So we moved into Oradea.
Were your parents happy to move to Oradea?
Well, they decided to move. They weren't very happy. It was a terrible upheaval. But it was my mother's initiative. She was a very forceful lady. And she had the courage of her convictions. Other people might have hesitated, thinking perhaps it's not the right thing to do, but she knew that was the right thing to do. So we moved, and we managed. We moved to a much smaller place. We moved into 2 flats in the same block. We had a little block of flats of our own, and we took 2 flats from there, and we moved in. It was much, much smaller than before. And then I went to a day school, also a convent school. I forgot to tell you that when I was 10, I was sent back to the boarding school where my sister was, which was a convent school, a French convent school. So I was there for 2 years, and then the Hungarians came in, and then we moved to Oradea. After which I was a day girl. I went to a day school until 1944.
In what part of town did you live in Oradea?
Pretty well the center. There was a square in the center where the theater was, and a few shops. It was not the main shopping area. There was a whole street which was the shopping street. But this was the center, I would say, yes. There was the theater, few shops, school, and not far from the river. There was the same river that went to Alești. That was the same river that was in the middle of the town.
Can you describe what your daily life was like?
When I was younger, as a child,
In Oradea.
in Oradea. Well, it revolved mainly around school. I would go to school. School started at 8 o'clock. And it was quite near, and one walked everywhere. There was a tram, but nobody had a car, and to take a taxi or a carriage was unheard of, unless there was a good reason for it. So I walked to school. I would leave home about 10 to 8 and be there by 8 o'clock when the bell rang. And there were classes of about 35 children. Quite a few Hungarians from Hungary who was brought there, civil servants, children, bankers' children, that sort of thing, who were brought there after this change of regime. And there were very few, 2 or 3 girls whom I knew before in my previous school, who transferred to this school as well. And it was quite good. It was a mainly Hungarian language school. And Hungarian being my mother tongue, it was quite easy for me. The previous school, of course, was in Romanian, and some of it was in French, mostly Romanian, but there was some emphasis on French.
What language did you speak at home?
Hungarian. But as a young child, I spoke German with my old grandmother. I called her my old grandmother, because she insisted on that. I was really bilingual at one point, and then I forgot all the German I knew.
What was your personal first experience of anti-Semitism?
That was at school. These girls would giggle behind my back and make remarks and this sort of thing, nothing official, but it was felt quite strongly.
Did you ever talk about that with your mother or father?
No, I didn't. There was very little point to it. We couldn't change the situation, really.
Was there at any point at that stage that you'd felt fear?
Not at that stage, but later on I did, yes.
How was the relationship between the Jews and the Gentiles in Oradea?
Well, there was a little bit of social contact. People who were friendly before the war would continue to be friendly, but very often it cooled off. The Gentiles just dropped away. And of course later on it was very difficult because the Jews had to, this was much later in 1944, Jews had to wear a yellow star, and they were pariahs, really, so the Gentiles wouldn't think of being seen with them in the street.
When did the German army enter Oradea?
In March 1944.
And what happened?
Well, they marched into the town. We didn't feel anything at first. We just saw them. Their presence was there everywhere. Every now and then somebody would knock at the door or ring the bell. It was a German soldier asking for food, which was very surprising because it was a well-organized army. We didn't think that they would have to go begging, but they did. They were quite young. Some of them were 16, 17. And they asked for food. We gave them, they sat down and we gave them a meal, which they ate, and they said, "Thank you very much," and they left. Very civilized. I mean, as people, individuals, they were quite civilized. Then, in May, in March, soon after they came in, or even before, I can't remember now exactly, the Hungarians started enforcing the anti-Jewish laws that the Germans initiated, but I think the Hungarians were very willing partners in this.
And these were?
These were, as far as we're concerned, these were that my father couldn't practice law anymore. So we just had to live on what we had, and we had this little block of flats which brought in some money. We weren't short of money, but it was very demoralizing for my father not to be able to work, as it would be for anybody. This is the thing that I felt most. And then later on, after March, from end of March I think, we had to wear a Star of David of a definite size and definite color, sort of a strong yellow. And then my parents decided that I shouldn't go to school anymore, not with this yellow star on. So I went, and other Jewish children did the same. We went and they gave us our school certificates in advance, you know, early, because normally it was in June, sometime, June, end of June. So we received our school certificates, and that was it. I had nothing else to do, really.
How old were you at that time?
I was 16. 3 years earlier, I decided that I want to start and learn English. I loved the English language, and I used to listen to the BBC on the radio, which was forbidden, by the way. But we listened very sotto voce. And I loved the sound of it. So I absorbed it. So I continued my English lessons. That was the one thing that went on as normal. We had a private teacher, at least I had a private teacher. And other than that, it was very strange not to have to do anything. There was no program. I get up in the morning, I could sleep as long as I wanted to, which I didn't want to. But it wasn't nice.
Until then, you mentioned that you had led such a structured life and
Yes.
things had its place and its time.
Yes.
How did you actually try and maintain that to the best of your ability as a family?
You mean from March, when everything collapsed?
Yes.
Well, it was very difficult. And it became unstructured, really. But we were together as a family, so that wasn't touched or changed. And very soon afterwards, the Holocaust started.
How did your father fill his time during those months?
How did he think?
How did he fill his time after he was forbidden to practice?
He went back to Alej during the week to finish off all his unfinished business. That he was allowed to do. And also there were people who owed him money, so he got those monies in. And he wound up all his unfinished business, and that's it. It kept him busy, at least. Not as busy as he was before, but it was something to do for him.
When did things begin to get really bad?
In May.
And what happened?
Well, of course, this was a little bit, it was gradual, because there were announcements in the papers, Jews must not do this, Jews must do that. We weren't allowed to keep a maid who is not Jewish, but we had a girl who stayed with us in spite of everything. And in May, I think it was the beginning of May, there were rumors that there'll be a ghetto built and that we would all be taken in there. There were other rumors that that we would be taken away altogether from Oradea.
We have to change tapes now. Green in London, England. The language spoken is English, and this is tape number 2. You were mentioning that there had begun to be rumours that you would be taken away from Oradea.
Yes, there were all kinds of rumors. Most people didn't believe it, didn't want to believe it. Others said, yes, we'll probably be taken away and taken into the interior of the country, because where we were was very near the Romanian border, and with a war on, they probably want security at the borders. There were all kinds of explanations that people found, probably wishful thinking. My parents, and mainly my mother, was very pessimistic about it, or perhaps she was realistic, I'm not sure. She said immediately that this is bad, and if they take us away, it will be to Poland, and it will be to a death camp.
So you were aware of the implementation of death camps?
Yes, there were
camps.
rumors, but nobody wanted to believe it. Nobody acted on it. I believe that in Slovakia, the people who were taken away in 1942, much earlier. Now, if we had only acted on that, there was plenty of time to leave, to go away, emigrate, do anything. Nobody did. Very few. So at the beginning of May, there were announcements that people would be moved to an area in the town which would be reserved for Jews. So what happened was that an area which was predominantly Jewish was cleared of anybody who was not Jewish, and they erected a fence around it, and on the 7th of May they started moving people in there. they announced that this and this street will be moved on the 7th, another one on the 8th, and so on. I can't remember exactly how it worked, but I think we moved on the 7th or the 8th of May.
Do you remember that day?
I remember the day. I remember that we were told to take a suitcase and with clothes and blankets, bedding and food. So we took all that, and lorries came and we loaded everything on. And I think we were also traveling on those lorries, I'm not quite sure, I can't remember that. And we took mattresses and bedding and all this. And I know that my father's mother was put on this lorry because she couldn't walk. So we went into the ghetto and we settled into these little houses. We actually went to stay with the chief rabbi, with a Neolog chief rabbi in his house. And we were all in one room, just one room. So we put mattresses on the floor, and that's where we slept. And there were quite a few rooms there, but every room was occupied by several people, the whole family. And
what were the conditions like in the ghetto?
Well, there was food, because people brought plenty of food with them. And there was also a communal kitchen where they would cook food in some large cauldrons. I remember beans being cooked. There was no shortage of food, we weren't starving. And in May we weren't cold either. But as we were sleeping on the floor in the middle of the night, the soldiers and gendarmes would come in with torches and shine their torches in our eyes, in our faces. It was very frightening.
Can you describe your feelings on arrival at the ghetto?
I was stunned, I think. I didn't feel very much then. Later on, when we settled in a bit, then I felt that we must do something. We must hide or try and escape. Escape seemed almost impossible at that time.
Was there
sorry? There were, I remember looking down on a well, you know, the well that you have in big blocks of flats, and thinking if we could only get down there and hide, cover ourselves with loads of old clothes, then when the time came and they would take us away, because by that time it was this rumor was circulated again, then we could stay there. They wouldn't find us. And then we could survive that way until everybody was taken away, and then we could get out. I even voiced this plan to my parents, but they didn't really listen. I don't think it would have been workable anyway.
Were Jews allowed to leave the ghetto at any point?
My father's grandmother died while in the ghetto. There was one building which was fitted out as a hospital. And whoever died was allowed, I mean, the family of the dead person were allowed to go out and bury them. So there was a burial party, and my father went with them to bury his mother when she died. It would have been possible for him to escape then, perhaps. But he didn't even think about it, to leave us there, so he came back. That was about the only time that people were allowed out. There was another time, later on, about the 26th of May, when it became officially known that we were going to be taken away from there. That people who had relations in the ghetto, who were people from outside who were non-Jews, who had Jewish relations, were allowed to come in to say goodbye to them. There was a very high proportion of intermarriage in Oradea. Out of a population of 100,000, 30,000 were Jews, and many of them intermarried. So many wanted to come into the ghetto to say goodbye, to see their families. And that was on Whit Sunday, which in 1944 was on the, I think it was the 30th or 31st of May. So that was the only time I know of that people came in and went out again.
If I can take you back to the time you were still in the ghetto, was there any work that was allocated to you or any other members of your family during the time that you stayed at the ghetto?
Part of the ghetto was a tall building on the side of the ghetto, a very tall building, which was declared the Kommandatura. There, the Hungarians and the Germans worked together, mainly Hungarians.
This was the headquarters?
The administration, yes, the headquarters of the camp. I mean, I can call it a camp, it was the ghetto. And they took volunteers from the ghetto to help with the office work, with the administration work. My sister volunteered. And so she went there daily and helped with the office work, with the filing and typing and so on. And actually there were some people coming in and out of the ghetto, but not freely into the ghetto, only to the Kommandatura. There were people who, lawyers, accountants, people like that, who had unfinished business with Jews, who came in to try and wind everything up, tidy it up. And one day my sister saw Dr. Kish, his name was Jenő Kish, who was a lawyer, friend of my father's. And she got him to one side and said, "Can you help us escape? We're in a terrible state." He said, "I can't help you escape from here. But if you can manage to get out of here, then I'll give you the name of a teacher, a Romanian teacher, who will arrange for you to be taken over to Romania, to cross the border to Romania." So he jotted down the address for my sister. And we were thinking of doing this, of escaping and going there.
Was that together with your family?
I would have liked the whole family to escape. It was decided that they can't go because my grandmother at the time, my surviving grandmother, the younger one, was 68. Although she was a perfectly healthy woman, healthy and active, and she could walk. There was nothing wrong with her, but she felt that she would hinder us in our escape. And my parents also felt that we had a much better chance if only the two of us, my sister and I, escaped. Now we knew that on that particular day, people would be allowed to come in.
This was the Whit Sunday you
Whit
mentioned?
Sunday, yes. We knew that in advance. And that seemed a good opportunity to try and somehow escape, because there would be crowds coming in and going out. And this is what we did. On that morning, I went with my sister to this Kommandatura, and when people asked me, what are you doing here? I said, well, I've come to help. There is too much work. Eva can't cope. I came to help her. I was 16. I mean, it was quite plausible that I should be able to type a bit and so on. And previously, we had loosened our Star of David, the stitching, so that we should be able to rip it off quickly. And about midday or 1 o'clock, we went down. We left our coats hanging on the coat hanger. We went down and sort of milled around with the people who were coming in and going out and so on. It was a beautiful day, which helped us because it meant that there are lots of people walking in and out. So we latched onto a family of, I think, parents and 2 girls. We walked behind them, very close to them, as if we all belonged together. They were walking out of the ghetto, and we were with them. We walked out with them. They didn't realize this. And then we were out. Now the ghetto bordered onto a very large marketplace, which was empty on that Sunday. There was no market. And it was overlooked by the Kommandatura, which was a very tall building. So we didn't dare cross it. That would have been the shortest way for us to go back into town. We didn't dare do that, so we turned left alongside the fence, which was also risky because there were gendarmes everywhere, every 50 yards or so. But we walked until the first crossroad, and there we turned right. So we turned left along the fence, and then we turned right into the first crossroad, and then we were off. We got lost in town.
Before leaving the ghetto, can you describe the last hours together with your parents?
It was very difficult. The last 2 days before we actually left, I didn't want to go, and I was crying all the time. And of course Eva said, well, if you're not going, then obviously I'm not going. And my mother said, you must go. If you do, it will give us courage to fight on, to try and survive, because we will have the hope that you are safe. So this was an argument which I couldn't do very much about. And I had to stop crying because it was very suspicious. All of a sudden I start crying in the middle of the day and all the time. So I made a tremendous effort not to cry. And then on that morning we went in, both of us. We went into the Commandatura and we escaped. Later on, my mother, who survived the camp and came back, said that she watched us. She was standing far, but she was standing, there was only one gate, you see, so she was standing in view of the gate, and she could see us leaving. She could see Eva sort of pushing me, putting her hand on my back, and we were walking out. And she said that was a tremendous relief for her, that we weren't caught, we were out. We weren't safe yet, but at least we had hope.
Before having left the ghetto, was there any piece of advice that your parents had given you that was a source of strength for you during that time?
Well, they said, look after each other, look after yourselves. That's about it.
So you had managed to escape from the ghetto, you bypassed the marketplace,
Yes.
and you were coming towards the Romanian border.
Well, not yet, no. We went and looked for this Romanian family that we were given the address of. They were expecting us. This Dr. Kish must have told them that we were coming, and he paid them the money in advance for helping us out. So we went there, we were let in, which was very lucky, the way they were in. We went in and we just sat in an inner, we were talking of course, and made plans of how to escape. And we sat in one of the inner rooms. I remember there was a ring at the door, and they were very frightened, this couple, because if it had been known that they were sheltering Jews, they would have been punished. It was an offense. So they didn't know what to do. We hid in a cupboard, and they went to open the door. Then, a few minutes later, he came and opened the cupboard door, this was in a different room, and said, there's a man, he says that he escaped from the ghetto. So my sister said, ask him how he escaped. So he went and asked him and came back to say, he hid in the back, in the boot of a taxi. So my sister said, that's quite possible. So we came out, and it was a friend of ours. So from that moment on, we were three. There was this young man with us who was about 27, 28, and the two of us. And then this teacher went away, his name was Bogdan, went away to find the guide and came back. He said, it's all arranged. Tomorrow you take the train to this spa, which was very near town, and which was very near the Romanian border. It was within walking distance, a long walk, but walking distance. So we went there, and again the weather was beautiful, which was very fortunate. So we were walking, with this guide was in front of us at some distance, we were following him, and he went into the forest. We went after him, and then he guided us on a route which took us to Romania. He didn't cross the border with us, but he put us on the right track, and he said, you go in this direction. And he knew what time we should be crossing, when the patrols wouldn't be there. And we just walked through. So we were in Romania. In a little village, I can't remember the name. Perhaps if I saw a map, perhaps I could, that would remind me. But as we didn't have any money or any papers, we decided to go to the police and give ourselves up. Now the reason we did this was because we heard that in Romania Jews weren't persecuted, at least not to that extent. They may have been deprived of their professional occupation or things like that, but they weren't taken away or locked up or anything like that. So we went to the police station. Unfortunately, the day before, the then Prime Minister, who was a Nazi, Antonescu, gave an order to return all the refugees from Hungary back to Hungary. So they couldn't do anything else but arrest us. And because they hadn't dealt with this sort of thing before, they sent somewhere else, to another police station in another village, for a sergeant to come, for somebody of a higher rank, to come and deal with our case. We spent the night in this police cell, and the following morning the sergeant came and asked for our names. Name was familiar. Then he asked to see our handbags. We had a few photos with us of our parents. And when he saw my father's photograph, he recognized him immediately. My father defended him in a case a little while before. So this was a fantastic coincidence and helped us. So instead of returning us, putting us on a train and returning us to Hungary, he marked the file as returned to Hungary and let us go. Now, at this point, my mind is not quite, I'm not quite sure how it happened, whether we were actually taken to the train or whether he just let us walk away. My sister says that we were taken to the train, and then we were left there. This young man had an aunt in the nearest town, and he allowed us to make a phone call to this aunt. And somehow or other, I think they sent a taxi for us. There again, my mind is a blank. Not a complete blank, but a bit of a grey matter. Or a grey area, I should think. And so we went to this town, which was called Beiuș. And there we spent about a week. The Jews helped us, put us up. And there was one woman about my mother's age who came to see us. And she said, I went to school with Csillag Irén, and I heard that her daughters are here. So I came to see. And she let us her flat. She had a tiny little flat, one room. She went to move somewhere else, and for that 1 week we were sleeping there. We had our flat, which was wonderful. And generally the Jewish community helped us a lot. With papers, with clothes. We had absolutely nothing. We just walked out of the ghetto with our handbags.
Was there any way during that time that you could try and find out how your parents were?
No, it was impossible. There weren't even any rumors. Everything was delayed. Later on we heard that they had all been taken away.
So you'd spent a week in the flat of this lady?
Yes.
And then
they gave us papers, which was essential. Every 5 minutes somebody would stop you and ask for identity papers.
Were they false papers or
They
real
were
papers?
false. Well, they may have belonged to somebody. As far as I'm concerned, they were false. They were, my identity card was of a girl in village not far away called Mediaș. And I was supposed to be a Romanian girl. Now, in those 4 years of Hungarian regime, I'd forgotten all my Romanian. It's amazing how quickly one forgets. My Romanian was very, very good. But then it came back, of course. But I had to be very careful not to open my mouth at all when I was out. So we took the train. They gave us money and these papers and clothes, and we took the train to Bucharest. Because it was decided there, with this Jewish War Council, that our best bet was to go to Bucharest. Then, if we wanted to, we could stay there, being a very large city and good Jewish organization, or we could go to Palestine. There were transports from time to time that went to Palestine.
And who
boats.
was arranging the transports?
Well, there was the Jewish Zionist organization, the local one, but it was the Jewish agency mainly who financed the whole thing. So we went to Bucharest, and we stayed there for quite a few weeks. Of course, we were registered that we want to go to Palestine. An interesting episode, we went to see the headmistress of our old school, of the Notre Dame de Sion, where we went as boarders of the boarding school. You see, this boarding school didn't have this license renewed when the Hungarians came in, so they dispersed. And there was another house, they call them houses, there was another house of this order, of the Notre Dame de Sion, in Bucharest. So the headmistress was sent there. So we went to see her. And when she saw her, she said, well, I'll hide you here, don't go anywhere else, you can stay here. Wait for the end of the war and stay with us. We said no, we decided to go to Palestine. So she opened a drawer in her desk and took out a wad of money and said, this is for refugees. And as you are refugees and are old pupils, this is for you. It was all very, very moving, very touching. Anyway, time came that we were told that there'd be 3 ships leaving for Palestine, for Istanbul really. And then from Istanbul we would take a train to Palestine. So we all took a train to Constanza, which was the port on the Black Sea. And there we spent the night in the big customs hall, a huge hall.
What did you take with you?
We took clothing. The Romanian money wasn't much good to us, but we could spend it. We could buy what we needed in the way of clothing, and mainly clothing, really. I mean, what else can one take? We didn't take food with us. And shoes, clothing, that sort of thing. So we went and spent the night there, and there were quite a few hundred people there, nearly over 1,000, about 1,200 people, 1,100, all milling around, and Jews are quite noisy anyway, so now they were even noisier. And we spent the night, and the next morning we saw notices posted with lists of names to say who was allocated to which ship. And my sister noticed, I didn't even notice, I didn't go to see it, but she noticed that we were put on separate ships. And she said, well, we don't agree to this. Now this young man who came with us didn't come to Palestine, so then we were, he stayed, I think he stayed in Bucharest. So it was the 2 of us. And
did he survive?
He survived, yes. We saw him much later in Italy. Unfortunately, he died a few years ago. So anyway, my sister said, no, we don't agree to go on separate ships. Put us together, it doesn't matter. Take somebody else who is on his own and change it. it was very, very difficult because these organizers had made up their minds, and there was the list, and they had worked on it all night, and they didn't want to change it. So we really started creating. If you don't do that, we don't go. We go back to Bucharest, and we'll wait for the next time. And that was the last thing they wanted, because we were quite troublesome, really. So in the end, they decided to take me off the Mefkure, which is the ship that I was allocated to, and put me on the Bulbul, where my sister was. The three ships were Moria, Mefkure, and Bulbul. And they were to leave at half-an-hour intervals. When we looked out of the harbor, we could see these ships. And they were like matchboxes. They were so small and so mobile. And I didn't believe that they could sort of sail all that distance. So the Moria left. We all went and got onto the ships and tried to be as comfortable as possible. It was terribly overcrowded. These ships were Turkish melon boats, and they were 180 tons. Now, I don't know if that means very much to you. It didn't mean anything to me. All I saw was that we were very, very crowded, terribly overcrowded. But it was a question of just 2 days, because in 2 days' time we were supposed to be in Istanbul. So Moria left. Half an hour later, Mefkure left. And another half hour later, we left. And this was about midday, I think, by that time. So we managed to pass the time. We had food, we ate. In the evening, we went downstairs, or below, I think, below decks, they call it. And there were cots, like shelves, where you could sort of go onto it. Several, I think there were about 3 high, 3 or maybe 4 high, 3 high. So we made ourselves fairly comfortable in these cots and went to sleep. In the middle of the night, there was a huge commotion. And of course, we woke up and went up on deck to see what was happening.
We have to change tapes now. In London, England, the language spoken is English, and this is tape number 3. You mentioned that you went on deck to see what the commotion was.
We went on deck, it was still dark, and we could see flares in the distance. Now, we realized that this must be a bad sign, something bad, somebody in distress, or some signal. So there was nothing we could do, but eventually, a little later on, we found out that the second ship, the one that left just before us, was torpedoed by the Germans, and they sent off a flare, as SOS signal. And later, as it became light, it started to be light, we could see debris in the water. Bits of wood, timber, and people. People were swimming and shouting from the water. And to our surprise, dismay, or I don't know what to call it, shock really, we saw 2 of our friends in the water. We recognized their voices. It was a young couple. She was 9 months pregnant. We met this couple in Bucharest while we were waiting to be told that we could go on one of these transports. They were from Oradea, but actually he was from Oradea, she was from Budapest. And they got married. We didn't see any of them at all, but we knew them. They were friends, more distant friends perhaps. But in Bucharest we got very friendly. during the time that we were waiting there. And we had made arrangements to meet again in Istanbul, so that when we got on the train we could travel together. And here they were in the water, survivors of this torpedoed ship. Altogether there were 6 survivors out of about 380, something like that. So we pulled the 6 men out. When I say we, of course, I personally didn't have anything to do with it, but we pulled them out and helped them, and they were all unhurt, bruised but not hurt.
Was this the ship that you were supposed to be on?
This was the ship I was supposed to be on, yes, yes. Now this couple travelled together with her mother and her young brother, and she saw them die. She saw them being killed in the explosion. And then she said, well, I'm not staying here, let's jump in the water. And they jumped in the water before the ship sank. They were both good swimmers. And she was helped with being pregnant. It gave her extra buoyancy. So that was that. She was safe. She was full of bruises. They were both full of bruises, but they were unhurt otherwise.
Was there anybody else who you knew who had been saved?
No, there were the 4 people, the additional 4 people whom we saved, pulled out of the water, whom we met then. They were not previously known to us.
Can you describe life at sea?
We were supposed to be in Istanbul in 2 days, so really there should have been very little to talk about. But as it happened, after this incident with the torpedoed boat, we went on our way, and incidentally, the crew, who were Turkish and who didn't know one word of any other language, wanted to leave the ship. They caught a fright when they saw the Germans. I don't know if they could actually see the German ship or not, but when they saw what was happening, they wanted to leave. There was a boat, lifeboat, and they wanted to get onto this lifeboat and leave. The Halutzim, the young men who were well trained and were part of a Zionist organization, didn't let them. By force they kept them back. Another thing that was rather alarming was that you couldn't communicate at all with these Turks, because not only didn't they speak any other language, but even their body language was different. They would nod when they wanted to say no, and they shook their heads when they said yes, until we realized that it was a little bit difficult, although I remember reading about it in books, you know, in adventure books of travel, but I've never seen it actually happen. So anyway, after this incident with the German torpedo, we went on our way, and later that evening, or late afternoon, the wind got up and it became very stormy. The water turned completely black, from a blue, from a nice dark blue, it was black. And I remember thinking to myself that this must have given the name of Black Sea to that sea. A storm came, and it broke our tiller and a mast. I can't remember if there were 2 masts or just one. Can't remember, but one broke for certain, and the tiller broke. That means that we were helpless, we were just drifting. And the current was taking us back north towards the Bulgarian border. Now the Bulgarians were allied with the Germans, and it would have been a disaster if we had been taken back to Bulgaria. Luckily, the storm steered us into a small bay just about 1 or 2 kilometers off the Bulgarian border, a Turkish bay called Inada. And there we stayed. Obviously, some people, because it was very near the border, there were military. There were no civilians. And a Turkish officer came and boarded the boat and wanted to know what was happening, who we were. So we managed to explain something to him, and he went off. Obviously, he didn't let us land. He had to report back to his superiors and see what could be done about us. But what he did was he agreed to send a telegram to the Sochnut, to the Jewish agency in Istanbul. And that started the ball rolling. I can't remember what the sequence of events, what happened next. But we were on that boat in this little bay for 10 days. There was enough food. I can't remember if they brought us food or there was enough food on the boat. We weren't hungry. We stayed there and we were wondering what was going to happen to us. But eventually we were allowed to land. And they arranged a convoy for us, a convoy of carts, horse-drawn carts, for the luggage. We had kit bags. Nobody had suitcases. We all had kit bags. And this pregnant lady, whom we brought out of the water, and there was another pregnant woman as well, and the two pregnant women were allowed to be on the cart. The rest of us walked. And we walked all the breadth of Turkey towards the southeast, towards Istanbul. Before Istanbul, about 100 kilometers before, we came to a town called Cherkezköy. And there we were able to board a train. And then the train took us to Istanbul and then took us on towards Palestine via Lebanon and Syria.
Staying on the boat for a moment before you arrived, could you tell me whether there were any other incidents on the boat that may have been difficult or alarming?
Well, it was only with the crew, really. They had to keep watch on the crew. And these young Halutzim really did an excellent job.
How did the crew members treat the people who were sailing, the refugees?
They didn't regard them at all. Not at all. We were just cargo. We were ordered up and down and back and forth. And of course, when the storm came, then things came to a crunch because the ballast in the boat wasn't fixed down properly. So it kept moving in the bilge water from left to right or from port to starboard. And it upset, with all those many people, it was very difficult to keep the balance of the boat. So one of these young men of ours saw what was happening and shouted to everybody to move to the right or to move to the left. But of course, right and left are relative directions, dependent on where you're facing. So you can imagine the chaos that followed. There is a reason for calling the left side of the ship and the right side of the ship port and starboard. But anyway, somehow we managed to get there.
So you took a train and you arrived in Palestine.
We took a train which lasted a few days. The trip lasted a few days. We arrived in Palestine. Before we arrived in Palestine, we stopped at in a Lebanese town. I forget what it was called now. I can't remember the name. I would remember it in time. In Beirut. I think it was Beirut. And at night, it was night time and the train stopped. We didn't get off the train, but we saw a crowd of people, beautifully dressed, come to the station, to the train, to see who was on board. They were Romanians who were living in Palestine, who emigrated some time ago, and were on holiday in Beirut, and they heard that there was a transport here, a train from Romania. So they came to see if they had any friends or acquaintances. There was one lady in particular who was absolutely beautiful, and she was beautifully dressed in a white suit, her hair immaculate, face made up, and here we were after about 3 weeks of, or 4 weeks possibly, of sleeping in our clothes, in the same clothes, and not having had a wash, and unkempt. We must have been a sight, an absolute sight. Later on, we met this lady in Tel Aviv, and we became very friendly. This is something to remember. So we arrived in Palestine.
Can you describe your feelings on arrival in Palestine?
Well, it was relief. It was also a culture shock, because everything was so very different. First of all, when we arrived, we were taken to Atlit, which was a military camp, and which served as a quarantine.
What date was this?
We arrived in Palestine on 23rd of August. I remember that very well because that was 1944, because that was the date that the Russians came into Romania. So had we decided not to leave, we would have been liberated, so-called liberated, on that date. Somebody who heard the news that we were coming, and who heard the news on the radio that the Russians had reached Romania, said, "Why did you come here? It is a very difficult country. You could have stayed there, and you'd have been better off, because now you would have been free." You know, the Russians came in. So quite a few people started crying out of frustration, because they felt it was a mistake to have left. We didn't. I mean, we didn't know whether it would have been we'd have been better off staying or not. We were not Zionists, but the idea of going to Palestine did appeal to us.
And what happened, what was the procedure that was underwent when you arrived at the port? At Alit?
At Atlit. The British immigration authorities questioned us, and they were quite satisfied that we were not spies or anything like that, and they gave us, they took our photographs, and they gave us our first identity paper. This showed that we were there legally. This was very important, because there were lots of illegal immigrants coming to Palestine. And it was really wonderful. For a whole week we were staying there. We could eat and drink as much as we wanted, and we slept in comfortable beds. First of all, we took showers, no end, and we could wash our hair. And
what did it feel like for a young lady to be able to sleep in a clean bed and be able to shower?
Oh, it was wonderful. It was really wonderful. It was like heaven after all that.
Was there a feeling of euphoria that you'd actually survived this?
Yes, absolutely, yes. Euphoria is always mixed with sadness, of course, and we still hadn't heard anything about our parents. That came later. I mean, later on we heard news of Jews generally, of Jews of Oradea, but we didn't have any individual individual news of our parents at all.
At the end of that 1 week, what happened then?
At the end of the 1 week we were let loose, and we were given £7 each by the Jewish agency, which of course was much more than £7 today. It was £7 sterling in 1944. And we were given the promise of a bed and mattress as soon as we could find a place to put it, which we didn't have. But there we were with £7 and a bit of a luggage, my sister and I, and we went to Haifa, which was the nearest town. In Haifa we were advised to go to Tel Aviv, because there were more possibilities in Tel Aviv. Our first shopping that we did with the £7 was some Cadbury's chocolate, whole nut milk chocolate. was divine. And then we went to Tel Aviv, and the the Jewish immigration organization helped us. We were introduced to various people who were helping, and we were sent to a hotel. There were these hotels that specialized in immigrants. They had large rooms, 4 beds in a room, so we shared. So we had these 4 beds, and we started looking for some work. And I decided to, well, it wasn't a quick decision. People came to see me, and we spoke and talked, and there was an organization called Ole Hungaria. For every country where immigrants came from, there was an organization called Ole Romania, Ole Hungaria, Ole meaning immigrants of, or immigrants from. So this Ole Hungaria gave us more clothes and gave us advice what to do. And in those days I still had the idea of eventually studying. I wanted to be a doctor. And of course I didn't have a matriculation because Hitler interfered and I left school at the age of 16. But I was told that it could be done. I could take an English matric in due course if I learned. I could learn privately and pass an exam, and then I would be ready to go on to university. But of course there was no university in Israel. There was the Hebrew University, but it didn't have a medical faculty in those days. So I wasn't quite sure of what I was going to do. I took a job in a little leather factory. It was a workshop, really, leather workshop, for small leather goods. We turned out very nice things like wallets and purses and that sort of thing. And then my idea was that eventually, if I learned a trade, I'll be able to work freelance in my own time, and I could study. Unfortunately, nothing came of it. I think I wasn't persistent enough. I didn't persevere enough. My sister started cooking. She cooked lunches in our hotel room on a little lamp called ptilia, and it was a not petrol, it was a paraffin lamp. So on this paraffin lamp she was able to make a meal. Not terribly elaborate, but quite good. And some of these new immigrants and people whom we met came to have lunch. So much so that at one point the hotel management started to inquire what was happening. There was a man came and left after half an hour, another man came and left after 20 minutes, and so on, until we explained what we were doing, which wasn't quite acceptable, but it was better than what he thought was happening. So that was all right. And here we were. I mean, there was this new land which was full of opportunities for us. Life was very difficult then. It wasn't easy to find a room or work or anything. But for us, being free and being safe was all that mattered. So we were full of enterprise and hope and everything.
Where were you when you found out that the World War II was over?
I was in Tel Aviv. All the time, even before the World War II was over, we went to the offices of the Sochnut and of this Ole Hungaria, because they were listing lists of people who survived and came back. And we were hoping to find the name of our parents. I wasn't really hoping to find the name of my grandmother. I knew she wouldn't have survived. But my parents, that was a possibility. And my mother indeed had survived. I never saw her name posted on a list. What happened was that all of a sudden, out of the blue, we received a telegram from somebody in Bucharest via London. There was still a war on, you see, so it was difficult. Well, it was just the end of the war. No, it was the end of the war. War was over. But communication was still very difficult. And we received this telegram from London to say Irene Jakobfi at home, quite well, something like that. And it was a fantastic feeling. I can't tell you, I couldn't talk. I was completely stunned when I read this. So was my sister. And then we started trying to communicate with her. We sent letters, which didn't arrive. Some did, actually. Some of the letters arrived. And we tried to go back to Romania to be together with her and possibly arrange for her to come to Palestine with us.
Did she communicate with you by letter in the meantime?
Yes, she wrote to us and we received a letter, but it was very sporadic. The post didn't work properly.
Where had your mother been after you had left the ghetto?
Mother was in the ghetto until she was deported to Auschwitz. She was taken to Auschwitz with my father, with my grandmother. And of course they were all separated as soon as they arrived there. My mother after a while, my mother was sent to another camp for work, a labor camp, which was a very good thing because it saved her. Later on I heard stories that she saved some inmates, she helped friends of ours in the camp. I have a friend who survived. She's about 2 years older than me. She lives in Paris, and she told me recently about this story of how it happened. And I had a second cousin living in Israel whom she saved as well. She was busy saving people, saving other people. And she herself survived.
When
She was liberated on the 5th of May 1945 by Americans. I can't remember the camp at which she was at the time.
Were you eventually reunited with your mother?
Oh yes.
When
yes.
was that?
We worked very hard at receiving a Romanian visa. Eventually we got a visa and we went back via ship, not the same ship, to Constanța, and then by train to Oradea. This was, I think, this was in August. In fact, I'm pretty sure it was in August, because the 23rd of August had been declared a national holiday, being the day when the Russians came in. And I remember that it was more or less celebrated on board the ship.
What year was that?
1947. So there was a break of 3 years of not seeing my mother. So in 1947 we went back in August and we were reunited. My mother was in the flat, in our own flat in Oradea, and most of the furniture was there. The Russians had occupied it previously. The Russians stripped the leather of settees and everything, whatever they could find, they stripped it. I don't know what they did with them. We had a bathroom where the bath wasn't built in, it was standing on legs. But we had a system of hot water which was heated up by the kitchen range. This didn't appeal to them, and they made an actual fire under the bathtub. They brought wood and made a fire under the bathtub, and that's how they heated the water. And generally they were very, very destructive. But some things have remained, some furniture, quite a bit of the furniture actually, and some paintings, some of it I have here now. And most of life in Oradea seemed to go back to normal as far as possible after such a terrible period. My father didn't return. Later on we heard how he died, or when he died rather. And we had to resign ourselves to the fact that he wasn't coming back.
Can you describe your first meeting with your mother?
She was at the railway station. We were coming from Bucharest by train. And I spotted her from the window of the train. And I said to her, "Look, there she is, there she is." And then we got down, we got off the train, and it was a very joyful and tearful reunion.
How did she look?
She looked quite well. Naturally, she had black hair, but her hair must have turned white, because when we saw her, she had dyed hair. She had dyed her hair a sort of a dark reddish black, you know, a bit of a red tinge, so I could see. When I said to her, "Look, there she is with red hair," that was it. She looked quite well. Prior to that, while still in Palestine, we received a letter from her. We received more than one, but the very first letter that we received, I saw her handwriting on the envelope, and I wasn't able to open the envelope. My hand was trembling so much. I started crying before I opened the envelope. And what I was quite happy about was that her handwriting hadn't changed. To me, this meant that she was her old self. And in her letter, I remember her saying that when she got to Budapest, because she got home to Oradea via all kinds of places, she got lifts here and there. When she got to Bucharest, she met somebody from Oradea who said to her, "Ah, your daughters, yes, but the ship sank. The ship was torpedoed by the Germans." And she said, "Well, you can imagine how I felt, but I didn't believe it." She didn't believe it. She went home, and then, of course, we started getting in touch, and we took up contact. So we got home, we went to our old flat, which was all very familiar, with most things in place, and we tried to settle down.
We have to change tapes now. We are in London, England. The language spoken is English, and this is tape number 4. So you tried to settle down again as a family in Oradea.
Yes, we settled in very easily. Everything was in place, and it seemed as if we had never left, really, except for the missing people, unfortunately. But really, it's as if that 3-year break had never existed. We started talking the way we did before, and so on. And then, of course, this took quite a bit of time to talk about everybody who remained, who is there in Oradea, who has left. Took a little time. And then we started planning. What would you like to do? And we said we want to be back to Palestine, and we would like you to come. While in Palestine, we applied for an immigration permit from the British authorities, and we hadn't heard anything. And my mother said, "That's fine, but how will that happen if I don't have a permit?" And we said, "We hope you'll get it. And if not, we'll have to think of something else. Perhaps we'll go somewhere else, perhaps for the time being, or altogether permanently." My mother wanted to go to France. She spoke the language, and that would have made it much easier for her. And some of her friends have left for France. This girl, I'm a woman now, who lives in Paris, her mother took her to France. They went to Paris, and they settled down there. So my mother thought it would be a good idea to go to France. But if we wanted to go back to Palestine, and there was the possibility, that was fine. We stayed in Oradea for a few months. Meantime, in November 1947, there was the United Nations decision to partition Palestine, and which would have given Israel, Palestine, a Jewish state. We weren't there then. We missed that. But months later, sometime in December, we got a communication, a letter addressed to my mother to say that she received the immigration permit. So that made everything much easier. And then there was the question of arranging an exit visa for my mother. The formalities and all that was terrible there. I think it still is. So Eva traveled to Bucharest. She was the arranger in the family. She traveled to Bucharest to arrange this, and she came back and it was all done. And then we started planning what to take with us. And we took all the furniture that we could, and all the pictures, and a few rugs, Persian rugs. My father was a collector of Persian rugs. We had, the whole house was covered in rugs. They didn't all remain, but whatever remained we took with us. And we had one big container, what they called a lift. They called it a lift. It was like a room, and everything went in there. Possibly we had two. I can't remember whether it was one or two. And that was sent in advance to Haifa. And then, of course, we booked our passage back again by the same ship that we came, which was the Transylvania. This Transylvania was a luxury yacht in its day, in her day, with a royal apartment in it. Now I'm going back in time again. In 1938 or 9, we went to a Romanian resort on the Black Sea called Carmen Silva. And that's where the ship was launched. It was new. And they opened it to the public to visit. So we went on this ship and we saw everything was so gleaming and beautiful. Of course, in 1947, in August, when we came back, it didn't look like anything like that. It was shabby and run down. But it was seaworthy, and there were bunks there to sleep on, so that was okay. And we took the same ship back to Haifa. So we arrived in Haifa sometime in January. I can't remember the exact date. And we docked in Haifa, and the view was beautiful. You know, there is the Carmel in the background. It was absolutely beautiful. My mother was very impressed, and she was also impressed by the fact that they didn't let us disembark because it was a Jewish holiday, and we would be handled, the disembarkation would be handled by Arabs, and they were worried that something might happen to us. I remember her writing to her friends in Paris, the mother of this friend of mine who was still alive then, to say we arrived and the weather is beautiful and everything is beautiful and everything is very strange, and we are being taken care of. We are safe and we're being taken care of. They didn't let us disembark because the Jewish workers weren't here. Eventually we disembarked, and we were taken to Tel Aviv by armored cars. The normal buses were fitted out with thick armor. I don't know how thick, but it should withstand some bullets, I think. So we were taken there, and then of course there was the problem of finding somewhere to live. And eventually we stayed in a temporary accommodation. My mother, oh, that's another story. Before all this happened, my mother managed to sell one of the houses that we had in Oradea. And from the money, she bought gold coins. Yes, she was a very, very clever woman. She bought gold coins, and she buried these gold coins in the cellar in our house in Oradea, in our flat, but the whole house was ours, the whole block of flats was ours. And the cellars were used mainly for storage, and mainly for storing firewood. So she went into the little cell, you know, the partitions that belonged to our flat, and she buried this. So when it came to leaving, she wanted to dig it up. She couldn't find it. And that was a terrible thing. And our friends tried to help, and my mother was frantic because we didn't have anything apart from that. And of course she was planning to keep this money in order to do something with it in the new place, for a new life. And then a friend arrived who said, well, I'll go and try, and you come with me, he said to me. And if somebody, we'll try and dig there, and if somebody comes, we are kissing and cuddling. Because had they found out what we were doing, it would have been a terrible thing. I mean, I think it was even a capital offense to hoard money or gold. You were not supposed to have gold. So we went, and people came to see us off, in other words, to say goodbye. And my mother was crying, and she was in a terrible state. We found this. I had my coat, this was winter, about December. I had my coat on my shoulder, a long coat, so I was holding this jar in which she put the gold so that it couldn't be seen, and I came up to the front door. My mother opened the door and said, asked me with her face, her eyes, and I said yes. So we went in, and this one lady who came to say goodbye to us, and who was rather distressed because my mother was in such a terrible state and she was inconsolable, suddenly saw her complete change of mood. Everything was fine. You know, she was smiling. She was looking at us as if to say, are you all mad? What happened? Anyway, there was the money, and it was quite a bit of money. So this was the money that we were able to use in Palestine, which it still was still Palestine until May. In 1948, January 1948, to buy a flat. So we bought a flat, a very small one. All the flats, most of the flats were small in Palestine. People didn't have the luxury of having extra bedrooms and dressing rooms and that sort of thing, but we were very happy to have just 3 rooms. So we bought this flat with key money. It wasn't a flat that belonged to us. It was like a lease, like an indefinite lease. It was ours as long as we stayed there. And my mother wanted to start a business. She said, we have to do something, we have to live on something. My sister was very talented with her hands. She was very, very good. And she did make some dresses in the past, just out of hobby. She would change things on her dresses, and she would make the... So she decided to start a dressmaking business. We applied to the WITZO for a loan for a sewing machine, which we got. And we were in business. When I say we, I had very little to do with it because I'm not very clever with my hands in that way. So I continued for a while this leather goods manufacture that I started. Eventually I left it and I took a job in an office. I was better in an office. After all, I could type at the age of 4, so that was something to use. So I took a job as they called it secretary in those days, but it was everything: typist, secretary, Girl Friday. And my mother and my sister started up this business. Started advertising, and by sort of referrals from person to person, people came, brought their materials, and they wanted to have dresses made. And it was very successful. Eventually, we decided, or my mother and Eva decided, to work for the ready-made clothing industry. So they made up a collection, and at that time I also joined the enterprise, and I went to sell, to take orders from shops. I took some orders, And really, it was a very, very successful business. They had about 4, 5, 6 workers. I can't remember how many. Of course, all in that tiny little flat. So by day, there was the workshop, and by night it was turned into a flat. Everything was put away. And we could have gone on like that for a long time, really. It was quite good. We had our own dresses, of course. Meantime, in May, well, I ran away with these thoughts, but in May, my mother had to have an operation. She had the operation and then she recovered, but it took a little time. But then eventually she was quite healthy. Yeah, she was quite all right. And on the 15th of May, Ben Gurion declared the State of Israel. The second day after the State of Israel was declared, my mother was still in hospital. The 3 Egyptian planes came over and started dropping bombs on Tel Aviv. We could see them. We could see from our balcony the 3 tiny planes. They were very small, and we could see the bombs being dropped. And there were other planes coming over and lots of casualties, unfortunately. And then Israel was at war. So recruitment started, and people had to go to the army. I also joined up. But in those days, you didn't have to join up full time. I explained that my mother needed me because we were new immigrants, relatively new immigrants. My mother was a completely new immigrant, and she needed my support. So I did what was called a giyus chelki, part-time army service, which wasn't terribly serious, really. But we did plane spotting. And there was, I got a briefing, which was not very adequate. I was only praying that there shouldn't be any plane, because I wouldn't recognize it. My job was to climb up on a very high tower, together with another girl, and sound a siren. There was a hand-operated siren. If an enemy plane came over, how would I know what an enemy plane is, especially at night? I decided if any plane came, I would sound a siren to be quite on the safe side. But luckily, nothing like that happened. And it's a terrible feeling to be uncertain about what you have to do. I tried to explain that I didn't really know, but they said, what do you mean you don't know? There it is, there's the profile of this plane, and there's the profile of that plane. You look up in the sky and you see. And also the engine sounds different. I said, engine? Different? So anyway, as I say, nothing happened. No incidents happened. And eventually, of course, there was the ceasefire. And then the war came to an end. And we just managed to live like this.
Where did you meet your husband?
I met my first husband in Palestine. He was Romanian, and he had been there for some time. He came to Palestine quite a bit before me, quite a few years. In fact, he went away to Persia, to Abadan, on a contract with a British company. I don't think it was Shell. I think it was another petroleum company. I'm not quite sure. And he worked there. And when he came back from there, that's when I met him. And we had quite a crowd of people who came from Bucharest and from Budapest and from Oradea. We were sort of a small social group. And I met him. We became very friendly. And he decided that he wanted to get married very soon. I said, well, I wasn't quite ready to get married. I was 17 at the time. This was about perhaps a year after I arrived. And we hadn't heard from my mother yet. Very soon I would have heard from my mother, but at that point I hadn't. And he was quite a bit older, so I understood that he doesn't want to waste too much time. So we decided to wait until we got together with my mother and then go on from that. So soon after we arrived back into Palestine and it became Israel, and we were together with my mother, then we continued this friendship and eventually we got married.
Did you have any children?
Yes, one son who now lives here.
And his name?
His name is Ronnie. His proper name is Doron Raphael, but we call him Ronnie.
And where did you meet your second husband?
Also in Israel. The first marriage didn't work out, and after 2.5 years we got divorced. And I met David. The first time I met him was at my sister's wedding, which was in 1952. It was not a very big wedding by English standards, but there were quite a few people there, about 70 people or so. And we were both there. I was there, obviously. It was my sister's wedding, and he was there as a guest. I think he was a guest of my brother-in-law's. And we never actually met. We were both there, and I vaguely remember seeing him there. And then we met again in 1959. This first time I saw him, or he was there, it was 52. And then we met in 1959, then we met properly. And we were attracted to each other. And we saw quite a bit of each other. And we got married in 1961 in Tel Aviv.
When did you arrive in your current country of residence?
Well, I live in England now. I arrived in 1965.
What made you decide to come to England from Israel?
Well, mainly my husband, because he's from England. He was born in London. He prides himself as being a Cockney. And his family pressurized him to come back. All his family were here. He, in contrast to my family, he has a very large family. He is the youngest of 10. And so, and being the youngest, you always stay the youngest. So everybody told him what to do, you see. And they said, what do you want to stay here? Come back and we'll all be together. And so I came back with him.
Was it difficult for you?
Well, unfortunately, my mother died. If my mother had been alive, I wouldn't have left. But she died just in 1959, just about the time when I met David. Just about that time, maybe a month or two before. So it was a question of parting with my sister, but it was important to come back. It was important for him to come back and be here. It was easier to find a job and find work and so on. So I came back with him. I love London and England. If it's a question of living anywhere outside of Israel, then I would be happiest to live here, which I am.
Was there a great difference for you between having lived in Israel and having lived in London now? Did you find it difficult again to adjust?
It is very different, completely different lifestyle. What struck me most at first was the grey sky. I missed the sun. I missed the blue sky and the sun, which was guaranteed from about May until end of October. And I found it a bit depressing, but not enough to make my life a misery. And other than that, life was very good here. There are lots of possibilities. People are kind, polite. There's an inborn courtesy here with people, which you don't find in other places, especially not in Israel, because people are too nervous and too hurried to be very polite. So I adapted quite well.
After having gone through the experiences you've described at such a young age, what do you think is your attitude towards change?
Change in general, or I don't like change very much, no. But I don't know whether that is a result of all the things that happened to me. I don't think women like change. They are basically more conservative than others, with a small c, of course. The other thing, of course, that posed problems was that we had to find a good school for our son. And that was a bit of a problem because he spoke English, but not quite enough. But this problem disappeared after a while. He picked it up very quickly.
How do you feel your experiences have affected your life?
They left a scar, a very deep scar which will never disappear. And I so often hear people who have been hurt by other people to say, I'm not bitter and I'm not revengeful or vengeful. Well, I can't say that. I am quite bitter when it comes to, say, Germans and Hungarians. But I found that it only applies as a generality, in mass. When I speak to a person, then I can't feel any animosity towards him. If that person is pleasant, then that takes it all out. The other thing is, of course, while in Israel, I started work for the government, and I was sent, of all places, to Germany. So I was in Germany for 3 years. And then later I was sent again to Belgium. And this poor child, of course, had to come with me, first to Germany and then to Belgium. He didn't have an easy childhood, but he managed very well indeed. So when I got to Germany, everybody was my enemy. I hated everybody. And later, when I found that I met a girl my age, I found that she was pleasant, and being my age, she couldn't have taken part in any of the atrocities that happened. So we became fairly friendly, and the animosity just disappeared. And then somehow everything got a little bit mellower, you know. If I'd found somebody whom I knew had taken part in these things, I could have killed him very easily. I could have. But in Belgium it was easier, because the Belgians didn't like the Germans either, although they were very much like the Germans in their way of living, and even their cuisine, their cooking is very much like the German.
Have you ever returned to your hometown since?
Yes, we went back once with my son because he wanted to see his roots. He wanted to see where I was born and the school I went to, and generally the town. So we did. But he was very busy, he still is very busy working, and he could only take 4 days off. So we flew to Budapest, and from Budapest I ordered a car. We were going to drive to Oradea, which would have been about a 5-hour drive. When I got to Budapest, I was told, in the hotel, I was told that at the border, when you came to the Romanian border, there was a delay of about 6 to 8 hours. Now, a 6 to 8 hours delay was no good to us, because all we had was 2 days, really. By the time we left Budapest, and we were going to spend 2 days in Oradea and then back again to Budapest to take the plane. So I cancelled the car and we took the train. The train was very slow, but it was safer somehow. And we got to Oradea in 6 hours. I couldn't recognize the place. It was so shabby, so run down. All the street signs were changed. The names of the streets were changed. Luckily, they couldn't change the river. I mean, the river was still there, so I was able to find our street and our house, or the flat rather, in the little block of flats which we owned. And so I showed my son around, and I showed him the ghetto and the building of the Commandatura. There is now a memorial there. They built a memorial by the side of a synagogue. We tried to get into our flat. I rang the bell, but the people were away. And some neighbors said that they are away on holiday. This was in the summer. Then I tried to find another small block of flats which my grandmother owned, which I didn't know the address, and in any case the street name was changed. But I knew roughly how to go. I knew I had to go alongside the river and then turn right. And I couldn't remember the house number. But I did remember that it was green. It was painted an olivey green with oil paint. And I said to Ronnie, you know, we were walking. I said, we're looking for a green house, you know, painted green. He said, there it is. So he found it. And of course I recognized it once we went in under the drive. There's a drive in most of those houses where the carriages used to go into the yard. And there were paintings on the wall. Paintings of Venice, of all places, of the war. So I showed him that, and I spoke to a few of the people there. In the whole of Oradea, there wasn't one person whom I knew or who even remembered us. Nobody.
How old was your son when you went with him?
That was 3 years ago. He's now 47, almost 48, 45. It was quite an experience.
We have to change tapes now.
Let's see.
I'm conducting an interview with Mrs. Marianne Green. We are in London, England. The language spoken is English, and this is tape number 5. You mentioned that this was quite an interesting trip, having gone back with your son. What are your reflections on that trip, having returned so many years after World War II?
It was sad, really. I never wanted to return. The only reason I did go back is because our son wanted to see it, and I thought I wouldn't want to deprive him of that. So we went back. There wasn't anybody in the town whom I knew, whom I had known previously, or who knew us. There was just one couple. He was a doctor, I think, an ENT specialist, who had heard of our family. So I had his address from a friend here, and I rang the bell. We went for a walk through a town. The whole town isn't very big, so we just walked everywhere. And I came to this address, I rang the bell, he was in. I explained who we were, and he let us in, and we had coffee. And we chatted for quite a long time. He didn't remember, he remembered the name. He didn't remember very much of our family. His own life was rather sad. He had been in the camps, he survived. His 2 sons, one of them was living in America, the other one was almost starving in Romania. He remarried a young woman who was very, very nice, very pleasant. And he said to me, why don't you look in the phone book in case there are any relatives here? I said, we have no relatives. Nobody was left here. He said, look, here's the phone book, look it up. So I looked in the phone book and I found a Jakobfi, but spelled differently. Our name is spelled at the end with an F-I, which is the normal way of spelling. This one was spelled with double F-Y, which is the sign of aristocracy. I said, this can't be family. This cannot possibly be related. He said, ring up, why don't you? I didn't ring up from there, went back to the hotel, rang, and a very friendly woman answered. And I explained who I was, and I said, I just rang up in case we were related. He said, if you don't mind my asking, are you Jewish? I said, yes. He said, but then we can't be related because we are not. My husband isn't Jewish. But my maternal grandmother was Jewish. So obviously that makes her Jewish in halakha.
In Jewish law.
In Jewish law. I said, well, next time we're here, I will ring you again and perhaps we can meet. Oh, I would very much like to meet you. Perhaps you can come for a quick coffee or something. I said, that's impossible. We're taking the train at 3 o'clock. There isn't time. So that was that. We went to the train. It was due to depart at 3 o'clock. And we were looking at the board to see, you know, to find the track, the platform for our train. And suddenly somebody is running, a woman, with a bunch of flowers and with a bottle of liquid, and with a young man in tow. So this was her. She looked at me and she obviously realized that I was a foreigner. So she said, Jakobfi? I said, yes. She says, well, I'm Margit Jakobfi, whom you rang, and I came to see you off, which was, I thought, was very nice. She gave the flowers, we all made acquaintance, and she brought a bottle of herb tea, which she thought we would like to drink on the way, which was really lovely. So we corresponded afterwards. I'm afraid I owe her a letter. I've been owing her a letter for a long time. But after this, I think I'll sit down and write to her, tell her all about this. And that was awfully nice. It made me feel much better. The whole trip, my whole stay in Oradea and Alest, we also went to Alest, of course, was rather sad. We took a taxi. I'm jumping back in time again. When we were in Oradea, we took a taxi and we kept the taxi all day to go to Alest and wait for us and come back, and then to go to this spa from which we escaped. So our son saw everything, and he saw the school we went to. Actually, we went into the school and we were allowed to look around, and I showed him the classrooms and everything. And when we went to Alest, where we actually lived before we moved into Oradea, that was a very big house. It was now the townhouse. The town, what would you call it? Well, I don't know. Anyway.
Town hall?
The town hall, that's right. It was the town hall. And being a Sunday, the caretaker let us in. There was nobody there because it was all offices. So he went with us and opened each room one after the other. And I could show him, this was this room, that was that room. And I showed him the view from the balcony, which was a beautiful view. And he was, he really loved that. And I thought how different everything is. I mean, it's the people, it's the family that makes a place. The house was kept very nicely, in very good condition, but it was nothing. It didn't mean anything to me anymore. And then we went back to Oradea and to this spa where we escaped from, and then to the train, and I met this lady. So she really changed my mood. It was very, very pleasant. And that's about it. I don't think there's very much more to say, really.
How do you feel your experiences have affected your Jewish identity?
Oh, they made it much stronger. Before, when I was a child, we mingled with everybody, and I wasn't particularly feeling Jewish. I felt, I just never defined it the way I felt. We were Jewish, but we weren't practicing Jews. So we belonged to a group of people who were the same as us, also Jews, but not practicing. It didn't mean very much, really. But after all this, now I am Jewish, really.
Have you ever discussed your experiences with your wife and your son or your grandchildren?
No, not very much, no. My son asked me about my experiences, and then I always told him something, part of it. I never sat down to tell him everything, from beginning to end. But funnily enough, he asked me to write it down, or to speak into a tape, and then he'll get it, somebody, possibly a granddaughter, to type it. He said it's a pity not to leave my memories for the family to have and to think about. So I promised to do that.
How many grandchildren do you have?
3.
And how old are they?
The eldest girl is 23.
What's her name?
Her name is Laura. The next one is Julie. She's 21 in 2 weeks' time. And Adam will be 16 on the 7th of July.
Why did you come forward to tell your story today?
I felt that I wanted to immortalize it. I wanted to remain on the archive, not to be lost. I suppose for the same reason that our son wanted me to write it down.
It is now 50 years since Israel was established as an independent state. What are your feelings towards the establishment of the State of Israel in relation to the Holocaust?
Well, I feel that it was a very necessary thing. It was very good for Jewry, and I think it will ensure that this sort of thing will never happen again, because there is a State of Israel now. It's a small State of Israel. It's a small country, not very rich, but rich in natural resources, in manpower resources. And Israel has friends in the world.
Is there anything else you wish to add that you may have omitted?
I don't think so. Probably when I see the tape, I remember that I omitted certain things. But
It's now 53 years since the end of World War II, since the end of the Holocaust. Is there any message that you would like to leave for your children, your grandchildren, for posterity, and for humanity in general?
well, I think that it's very important to to be true to oneself and to one's own community and the country as well, but mainly to one's own community. If you're Jewish, it's important to be Jewish and not to try to leave the faith, or it's important not to marry non-Jews, I think, because it will dilute everything eventually if everybody does that. And I think it is very important to keep it, to keep the Jewishness alive. And other than that, of course, there's no special message, other than a mother would leave her children and grandchildren. I hope they'll be fulfilled and happy, and I hope they'll never have to hide their Jewishness. That's a terrible thing to have to do.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mrs. Green, we are now united with your husband and your son. Would you like to introduce them?
This is David Green, my husband. This is our son, Ronnie. Doron Raphael, really, but we call him Ronnie Green. And here we are.
Mr. Green, how did you meet your wife?
In Israel, by chance. Was it by chance? Yes, I suppose it was. We actually met a long time back, and we neither of us remember meeting her, except I remember one little thing. She had a certain dress that she wore on that particular occasion, and which I caught up with later on, and it reminded me of the fact that I had seen her before. And that was about, wait a minute, that must have been about 9 years back?
7.
7.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
7 years back.
7 years back, and then we met after that properly. And as I say, we were at her sister's wedding, and you didn't even remember me then, did you?
Very vaguely.
Mm. Yeah.
When was the first time you heard of your wife's experiences during the Holocaust?
Quite some little time after we met, quite a lot. We didn't really discuss Holocaust in the early stages, did we?
No. No.
I can hardly remember. All I remember really knowing some proper information about it was when I asked her to speak at our annual general meeting of an ex-service association to give the people the people who were at that meeting an insight as to life in Israel at that time. And really that was the first time that I started quizzing her, because in order to ask her to give a talk, we wanted to know what she was going to talk about. Was that pretty
Yes.
well what happened?
Oh, yeah, sure.
Did we speak very much about Holocaust before?
No, no, very little, hardly at all. But
And
of course
really-
I didn't speak about life in Israel either. I spoke about life. I spoke about my escape, mainly.
Yes.
Mm.
And after having heard what you'd heard when your wife spoke on that evening, what impression did it leave you with?
Well, it left me, first of all, the whole thing was sort of a bit of a miracle on the quiet, really, because to have started off from the ghetto that had been formed and to end up in Israel, or Palestine as it was then, was in itself a bit of a miracle. The fact that the sergeant of the police turned out to have been a client of her late father, that was fantastic. That was the beginning of her escape, really, because till then it was, it's not really fair to say it was the beginning of her escape, but it was a rebirth of the escape by meeting that man.
How would you describe your wife?
A very definite person. A person who's got her own ideas. She's very, actually, she could be somebody in the military very easily, because she's very strict about time, for instance. You know, things have to be done on the moment. They can't be postponed. She's very loving. We have a wonderful relationship. I think she's a good grandmama. She adores her family. She expects nothing from them. She gets a lot of love from them, from all of us. And I don't know what more to say. It's very natural somehow.
Do you think that your wife's experiences have affected her in any way?
If so, it's kept very much under control. It doesn't come out in normal living. That's my impression.
And is there anything you'd like to say to your wife?
What do you mean, how much I love her?
You're the
I
boss.
used to say that. No, I think we're very lucky with one another. That's the main thing.
Thank you.
And I'm very lucky as well to have another family added on, apart from a wife.
And now turning to you. Your name is Ronnie, correct? How much of your mother's experiences were you aware of as you were growing up?
When I grew up, most of my teachers had numbers on their arms. So the Holocaust was part of my upbringing anyway. So in Israel, my mother was less of an exception than she is here, because everybody had gone through the Holocaust who was my mother's age and younger. But as the years developed and we came to England, and I became more aware of being Jewish than I was in Israel, because in Israel you're not Jewish, in Israel you are a #1 citizen and the world revolves around you. Her experiences became more exceptional. And when I had my own kids, they became even more exceptional, because when I realized how young she was when it all happened, and I looked at my kids of that age, I realized how amazing she must have been, and how much tougher they would have had to be to put up with it and to cope with all the hardship. To escape, to find work at 16, to pretend you can type when you can't, to get an interview and to pardon the expression, on film, to bullshit your way into positions that if you didn't need to, you wouldn't. So it's need. Necessity is the mother of invention.
Do you feel that having a mother who has been through what she has been through has affected you? And do you feel that you're different to other kids whose parents may not have been through Holocaust experiences?
Because I had two distinct lives, one in Israel and one here, latterly here, I probably find it easier to respond to the time here. Because, again, in Israel I was less of an exception, and so was my mother, than since we left, and I realised in what a minority she really is. My mother's actually an Iron Lady. And she's the only person I know who's gone through the Holocaust and doesn't really talk about it unless you ask her. I've heard many people say, if you had to go through what I had to go through, I say it to my kids, and I haven't been through anything like my mother has. So she never uses it as a weapon or a way of justifying anything, not that she has anything to justify, or of a way to illustrate hardship, because she came from the most fantastic lifestyle to zero, almost overnight. And I don't know how many people could actually cope with it and stay normal. I think that she's by nature the most unselfish, unself-centered person I've ever known. Whether that's because of what she's been through or not, I don't know. I think that is her nature, because I know other people, both related to her and otherwise, who've gone through it, who are not the same.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure whether it added or detracted, but I think she was probably born exceptional in many ways. No, this is, I don't know, probably not the time
You're
or the
quite
place.
right.
I think the environment affects us to an extent, but there are genes. And I think my mother was born with exceptional genes.
When you went back with your mum to Oradea and
Alleged.
thank you. What effect did it have on you seeing your mother seeing this again? Observing her, as well as your own feelings?
I took a risk in persuading my mother to go back because it was my persuasion more than hers. And I've seen programs on TV with people going back to where they've had emotional upsets, including British soldiers to the Falklands and American soldiers to Vietnam and worse. And the risk was that it would cause my mother a lot of grief that would open up old wounds. But being the Iron Lady that she is, I didn't know what it did, except that she explained to me very matter-of-factly, this is where the ghetto was, this was the Commander Tour, this is where we escaped, we crossed that bridge over there, and then we literally went along the path and the roads of where she went to, and this was the forest, and this was the border, and that's where we went. Absolute poker face. And not many people could do that, because she hasn't been back since, other than, I think, once, to bring my grandmother
About
over.
47, I think
47.
that was, wasn't it?
And that's a hell of a time gap with a lot of things that have happened. I wanted to go back because I was brought up with all the stories, not necessarily about the ghetto. Here again, an illustration of my mother. The stories were never about the escape or the terrible things that happened to her or my grandmother, even though obviously I'd been told them. The stories were more about the games they used to play in the garden and how she used to hide in the pantry and wet herself once, and when she was a baby, obviously. And it's all their stories that came back when I went to see the house, and that was the pantry, and that's where your grandmother used to sit, and that's where your grandmother owned the little house, and everything came to light. And I'm a great one for finding the past and roots. I take my kids back to Israel to show them where I was brought up, but I'm not convinced they're that interested. Maybe that's what makes us different.
Have you told your own children about the experiences your mother went through that you know of?
Many times.
And how do they respond?
They think she's fantastic. but to them it's a distant adventure story, like Seder Night talking about the Exodus from Egypt. Not quite as far back, but to them it's very, very removed. And they are so fascinated by it that my two daughters have often said that my mother ought to write a book and they'd like to help her do it, and it's still a possibility. I think she should. I think everybody should write a book, and the whole thing should be compiled and put together with your program. They are very, very interested, but it doesn't touch them as much as it would touch the first generation, because they're one removed.
Do you think you're aware, or were ever aware, of the emotional effect your mother suffered? Did she ever open up or let you feel that, well, it wasn't always okay?
My mother only ever had one son, and that was me. That was a privilege, but to her it was probably a burden as well, because everything was focused on me, with the result that I think if anything would have ever happened to me, she would have been more devastated than another person in her position who had not gone through what she'd gone through, because she'd already suffered loss. She lost her father when he was about my age. Yes?
Yeah.
About that?
Yes, he was 48.
48. I'll be 48 this weekend.
Thank you.
That's a loss. She lost her home and her schooling and her chance of education and her friends and her mother temporarily, because she didn't know whether her mother was alive or dead for a number of years. And to go through that and then to find that your mother is alive makes you doubly or trebly protective of your mother. So my earliest memories are of 3 adoring Hungarian women doting over me in Hungarian. That's my mother, my grandmother and my aunt, with whom my mother escaped. I'm sure you were told all about that. And one thing I never lacked was love and adulation. I think that I haven't forgotten your question. I'm going about it in a slightly roundabout way, but the effect on what my mother went through probably made her focus on me to the point where I'm aware of my mother 24 hours a day. When I'm not here, I think about her. When I don't phone, I think about her. When I phone, I obviously think about her. When I was a kid and David came along, he's my stepfather, as you're probably aware. They used to go out for dinner, and they may or may not know this, but I couldn't sleep until I knew they were back. And I used to stand by the window in our little flat in Tel Aviv, holding on to the bars, and David had yellow lights on his car. And when I saw the yellow lights, which were distinctive, then I knew they were coming back, and I went to sleep.
Really? You never told
Never
us
knew
this.
that.
Never knew this.
So it goes both ways, the protectiveness. And if my mother talks on the phone and her voice sounds a bit odd, then I immediately start to pry, what's the matter? So we probably drive each other mad.
Is there anything you'd like to say to your mum at this point?
She's the most amazing person I could possibly wish for as a mother. And this isn't mush, this is a definite. Because I say this to third parties as well, which is what really counts. And she has put up with many times more than the average person. On top of it, I'd probably do 1 or 2 things that, slightly risky things in life, which an average mother would have probably had an apoplexy over, but my mother sits quietly. I know she suffers quietly because of it, but it's just one of those things that one has to do. And I'm never unconscious of that. I've probably worn her down a little bit through having gone to the army and done various things, which probably wouldn't have had as much effect if she hadn't had all the losses that she had. But I admire her all the more for putting up with it. And she's a very brave person.
I agree with that, very much so.
Thank you very much. Thank you, all of
Pleasure.
you. interview with Mrs. Marianne Green. We are in London, England. The language spoken is English, and this is tape number 6.
These are my parents, Dr. Albert Jacobfi, my father, and his wife Irene Jacobfi.
When was this picture taken?
This was taken in 1920, I should think, in Romania. This is my father as a young officer in the Austro-Hungarian army in the First World War, Lieutenant Albert Jacobfi. The picture was taken in Hungary. The year should have been 1917, I think. This is my maternal grandmother, Etelka Csillag, maiden name Wallerstein. The photo was taken in Hungary. The year, I couldn't be quite sure. I can't be quite sure of the year. I think it must have been the 1920s. This is my sister Eva. Her married name is Swirsky. This picture was taken in Israel in 1953. That's me, with my husband, David Green. The picture was taken in Tel Aviv in 1961.
The month?
February. March.
March, for goodness sake.
Now this picture was taken starting from left back. Is Adam, my grandson, my daughter-in-law Carol, my granddaughter Laura, younger granddaughter Julie, and my son Ronnie. And the picture was taken in Hertfordshire, England, in 1996. Not from left to right, my younger granddaughter Julie, my Machatonim, that is my daughter-in-law's parents, Rita and Michael Peters, my sister Eva Swirsky, my son Ronnie, Adam, the bar mitzvah, my daughter-in-law Carol, my husband David, myself, and Laura, our eldest granddaughter. And this was taken at the Pinewood Studios in Berkshire in 1996, England. This picture was taken in Radlett, Hertfordshire, England. From left to right, David, my husband, myself, and Ronnie, our son. And it was taken in September 1996. On the left is my daughter-in-law Carol Green. On the right, my sister Eva Swirsky. And the photo was taken in 1996 in Hertfordshire, England. On the left is our eldest granddaughter, Laura Green, then Ronnie Green, our son, and on the right is Julie Green, our younger granddaughter. The photo was taken in Radlett, Hertfordshire, England, in 1996. On the left is Leora Rosenthal, my niece, my sister's daughter, and on the right is my sister, Eva Swirsky. And this was taken in Israel in 1979.
What was the occasion? Do you remember?
Her wedding, Leora's wedding. This is a photo of my nephew, Michael Swirsky, my sister's son, and two of his sons, Roy standing in front of him, and Guy on his left-hand side. This was taken in 1990 in Tel Aviv, Israel. This is a photo of me, Marianne Green. This is the first Israeli identification document that I received. It was taken in 1948 in Tel Aviv, Israel.